The morning air outside Kessler Auditorium was cool enough to fog my breath, and I got there at 8:15, 90 minutes before the doors opened, because I needed the accessible seat in row 2 secured before anyone else could claim it. I had the confirmation email printed and folded into my bag alongside my grandmother's transfer chair permit. Seat 2C. Wheelchair space beside it. I'd emailed the events office 3 weeks earlier, described her hip, her oxygen tank, the 11 stairs she couldn't manage, and a coordinator named Priya had walked me through the layout over the phone, sentence by sentence, the way I like things explained. I have a habit of needing the structure of a thing before I trust it. 4 years of engineering coursework will do that to a person. You learn to ask where the load goes before you ask anything else. I checked in at the folding table under the breezeway, showed my student ID, took my cap and gown out of the garment bag, and went looking for my seat assignment card, the paper wristband each graduate got, tied to the row where their guests were seated, so families could find each other after. Mine read row 2, seats A through D. 4 seats. I'd used all 4. My grandmother Vivian in the wheelchair space, my mother Denise beside her, my father Paul next to her, and the 4th for no one in particular, just a buffer, because Vivian's oxygen line needed room to run without someone's knee in it. I walked the concourse once, gown draped over my arm, looking for the 2 of them, and that's when I saw the seating chart posted by the usher's table, laminated, with names typed into the boxes. Row 2, seat B, Denise Callahan. Seat C, wheelchair space, blank, as it should be. Seat D, Paul Callahan. Seat A, the one I'd left as a buffer, had a name I didn't expect. Grant Whitlow, my sister's fiancé. I stood there long enough that a woman in a graduation gown from the biology program had to say "excuse me" twice before I moved. I have a specific memory of counting the letters in his name, the way I count rebar spacing on a drawing when a number looks wrong, before I know why it's wrong. 7 letters, 5 letters, 12 characters occupying a seat that belonged to my grandmother's heir. I called my mother. She picked up on the second ring, already breathless, already somewhere loud. I said, "There's someone in seat A who isn't supposed to be there." She said, "Oh, that's Grant. Brooke wanted him close for pictures after. We figured you wouldn't mind, since it was just an extra seat." It was not an extra seat. It was 6 inches of clearance for a woman who'd had 2 hip replacements and needed to swing her legs without hitting a stranger. I didn't say any of that first. I asked where Vivian was. "She's in the car," my mother said. "Your father's bringing her around now. We didn't want her sitting too long before the ceremony even starts. It tires her out." I said, "Mom, I built that seat plan around her. The oxygen line needs slack. Grant can sit in general seating. There are open rows in the back half of the section." There was a pause, and in it I heard my sister's voice, not the words, just the pitch of her laughing at something, and my mother came back with, "Don't make this a whole thing, Nora. It's your graduation. Let's not start a fight over a chair." It's your graduation. That sentence has done a lot of quiet work in my family over the years, showing up right before something of mine got redistributed to someone else. I've learned to notice it the way I notice a hairline crack in a foundation photo. Small, easy to explain away, and never actually small. My grandmother raised me for 6 years, from when I was 8 until 14, in a 1-bedroom apartment 11 minutes from my elementary school, back when my parents were rebuilding a marriage that had come apart over money and, I understood much later, over Brooke. She was born in the middle of it, the reconciliation baby, the one whose existence needed to mean something, and it did. It meant most of the household's attention rerouted toward her for the next 15 years. The piano lessons, the braces on a schedule instead of whenever the budget allowed, the college fund that existed for her, and as I found out at 17, did not exist for me. My grandmother covered what she could. She worked the overnight shift at a medical billing company so she could pick me up from school, sat with me at the kitchen table doing algebra homework she didn't understand, but insisted on checking anyway, told me twice, On 2 separate afternoons, I still remember exactly that a person who builds her own foundation never has to stand on someone else's. I became an engineer partly because of that sentence. I liked that a structure either holds the load or it doesn't. There's no version where a beam performs adequately depending on how everyone's feeling about it that day. I liked the honesty of a stress calculation. I spent 4 years in a program where 30% of my cohort left by sophomore year, worked 2 part-time jobs through all of it, and paid my own tuition with loans I'm still going to be paying off at 30. My parents came to exactly one of my events in those 4 years, a departmental awards dinner, and left before dessert because Brooke had a dress fitting. So the seat mattered, not the seat itself. The seat was a placeholder for a decision, the same decision my family has been making since I was 9, about whose comfort gets prioritized when there isn't quite enough to go around. There is always, somehow, enough for Brooke. I can list the ledger of it without much effort, because I've had years of practice adding it up. The summer I turned 12, Vivian sold a set of her late husband's tools to cover a school trip to the state capital that my parents said they couldn't afford that month. The same month, Brooke got a $400 cheerleading uniform without anyone discussing a budget at all. At 16, I asked my father to come to a regional math competition where I'd placed second in the state. He had a scheduling conflict, which turned out to be Brooke's dance recital, a recital she'd been in 11 times before and would be in 11 times again. I didn't resent Brooke for any of it. Not really. She was 7 years old when the math competition happened, 5 when the tools got sold. She didn't ask for the imbalance any more than I asked to be the one absorbing it. The people who built the imbalance were the two who were supposed to be doing the balancing, and they never did. Not once that I can remember, not even after I stopped expecting them to. Vivian used to tell me, when I'd come to her apartment upset about something my parents hadn't shown up for, that I could either spend my life waiting for the scale to even out, or I could go build my own. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, no theatrics in it. She wasn't a woman who hugged you and told you it would be fine. She sat you down at her table, put a pencil in your hand, and made you finish the problem. That was the shape of love in that apartment. Not comfort exactly, but competence, the sense that a person could be relied upon to still be sitting across the table from you in the morning. I didn't understand until much later that competence was the rarer gift. I found my father wheeling Vivian across the breezeway, and she saw me before he did, lifted a hand off the armrest, gave me the smallest wave, like she didn't want to make a scene of it either. She had her good cardigan on, the navy one, and a corsage pinned to it that I'd ordered for her 2 weeks ago, white ranunculus, her favorite. My father's face did the thing it does when he already knows he's about to be in the middle of something, a kind of preemptive tiredness, jaw set, eyes already elsewhere. I crouched next to the wheelchair so I was at her eye level. I said, "They gave your seat to Grant." She looked at me for a second, and I watched her decide not to make it bigger than it was, which is a thing she has always been better at than me. She said, "I can sit in the back, sweetheart. It's fine. I'll still see you." I said, "No, you won't. The back rows are past the pillar line. I checked the sight lines in the venue diagram before I requested the seat. You won't see the stage at all." My father said, "Nora, come on. It's Brooke's fiancé. We can't very well ask him to move now. Everyone's already seated." I said, "Everyone is not already seated. The doors open in 40 minutes. He didn't have an answer for that, which meant he knew I was right, and I understood in that moment, not with anger exactly, more like the flat recognition you get when a number on a drawing finally makes sense, that no one in my family was going to fix this. Fixing it required someone deciding my grandmother's ability to see her granddaughter graduate mattered more than not inconveniencing Brooke's fiancé for one afternoon, and nobody standing in that breezeway was going to make that call except me. I stood up, told my father I'd handle it, and pushed Vivian's chair myself toward the auditorium doors, where I found Priya, the events coordinator, clipboard in hand, radio clipped to her blazer. I told her what happened. I didn't raise my voice. I've found that raising your voice gives people an excuse to focus on your tone instead of the problem, and I wanted this looked at as a problem. Plainly, the way you'd flag a load path that didn't check out. Priya looked at the chart, looked at Vivian, and said, "This seat was specifically reserved as an ADA accommodation. Sir isn't supposed to be there regardless of what your family decided among themselves. Give me 2 minutes." I watched her walk down the row and speak quietly to Grant, who looked over his shoulder at Brooke a few seats down, then stood, gathered his jacket, and moved without protest to an open seat in the back third of the section, the exact seats I'd suggested to my mother 20 minutes earlier. It took Priya 90 seconds. It could have taken my parents the same 90 seconds 20 minutes ago if either of them had decided it was worth doing. I wheeled Vivian into seat C myself, locked the brakes, checked that her oxygen line had slack, and only then did I let myself feel the thing I'd been holding off. Not rage, more like a held breath finally going out slow. I crouched by her again. She put her hand on my cheek, the way she used to when I was 8 and crying about long division, and she said, "You didn't used to be able to do that. Ask for what's yours without shaking." I said, "I had a good teacher." By the time I got backstage to line up with my program, alphabetically between a Kate Ostrowski and a Priya Patel, a different Priya, a small, strange coincidence I noticed and set aside, I had about 11 minutes before the processional started, and I spent most of them not thinking about my parents at all, which felt like its own kind of accomplishment. I thought instead about the structural design studio in my sophomore year, the professor who told our class that redundancy isn't a flaw in a system, it's what keeps the whole thing standing when one member fails. I had built redundancy into my life without fully understanding what I was doing. Vivian, my roommate Denise Achebe, who'd become closer to me than my own mother of the same name ever managed to be, a thesis advisor who wrote me a recommendation letter unprompted. None of them required convincing to show up for me. That was the actual difference, and I'd never let myself say it in those words until that morning, lined up in a polyester gown, waiting for my name. Standing in that line, I thought about a conversation I'd had with Vivian 2 years earlier, the week I switched my major from architecture to structural engineering. She'd asked why, and I'd tried to explain it in terms she'd understand. That architecture was about how a building looked, and structural engineering was about whether it stood up regardless of who was looking at it. She'd laughed, that short laugh she has, and said, "That sounds like you finally figured out what you actually need from people." I hadn't fully understood the comment then. I understood it standing in that line, waiting for my name, having just spent the morning discovering that my family could still, after everything, be surprised when I asked them to hold weight they'd claimed for years they were willing to hold. I thought too about the difference between forgiving someone and continuing to build your life around a load-bearing wall that keeps failing under weight it was rated for. I didn't need to punish my parents that morning. Priya had already fixed the actual problem, calmly, professionally, in under 2 minutes. What I needed to decide, standing there in a gown that smelled faintly of the dry cleaner's plastic, was what I was going to do with the rest of the day, and by extension the rest of my life, now that I had proof, recent, specific, time-stamped proof, that the imbalance wasn't a phase of my childhood I'd eventually age out of. It was the operating system. It had been running the same way since I was 9 years old, and nothing about turning 22 and collecting a diploma was going to update it on its own. Names started at 10:04. The dean read them in a flat, even cadence, 4 per minute or so, long enough that families in the crowd had time to whoop and wave posters between each one. I heard Brooks laugh again somewhere in the rows, high and unbothered, and I noticed I wasn't scanning the crowd for my parents' faces the way I had at every school event since elementary. I used to do that automatically, a reflex, looking for where they were sitting before I did anything. Read the poem, played the recital piece, crossed the finish line at a track meet nobody attended, but I checked the bleachers anyway. This time I kept my eyes on the stage steps, on the dean's hand extending for the handshake, on the exact place I needed to put my feet, so I didn't trip on the hem the way 3 people ahead of me nearly had. Nora Callahan, Bachelor of Science, Structural Engineering, summa cum laude. I crossed the stage. I shook the dean's hand, felt the diploma folder pressed into my palm, cool and slightly heavier than I expected, and I turned toward the crowd, the way we'd been instructed in rehearsal, a half-second pause for photos, before exiting stage left. In that half-second, I had room to look for them if I wanted to. I didn't. I looked instead toward row 2, found Vivian's navy cardigan and the small white shape of her corsage, saw her lift both hands above her head, and that was the only face in that entire auditorium I went looking for. I walked the rest of the stage without turning back toward where my parents sat. The reception happened on the lawn outside, string lights already lit, though it was barely noon, long tables of lemonade and little sandwiches, everyone's families forming loose orbiting clusters around their graduate. I found Vivian near the shade of a maple, my roommate Denise already crouched by her chair showing her something on her phone, probably a picture from the ceremony, and I let myself stand there a second, just watching the two of them laugh at whatever it was before I walked over. My mother found me 20 minutes later, program still rolled in her hand like she meant to hit something with it. She said, "That was embarrassing, Nora," having the usher pull him out of his seat in front of everyone. I said, "It was less embarrassing than my grandmother watching my graduation from behind a pillar." She said, "You always do this. You always make things bigger than they need to be." I thought about correcting her, pointing out that the seat had been secured for Vivian 3 weeks in advance, that giving it away was the thing that made it bigger, that a 19-minute fix executed by a stranger with a clipboard had been available to her the entire time, and she'd chosen not to take it. I didn't say any of that. I'd already learned, standing in that breezeway an hour earlier, that there wasn't an argument sturdy enough to hold up against a family system that had been distributing its weight the same way for 22 years. You don't win an argument with a structure. You either reinforce it or you build somewhere else. I said, "I'm not going to do this today. I'm having lunch with Vivian and Denise. You're welcome to join us, but Brooke and Grant aren't invited. Not because I'm punishing anyone, but because today is the one day in 4 years I got to choose who sits closest to me, and I already made that choice this morning." My father came up behind her in time to hear the last part. He didn't argue. He looked, for a second, like he might have understood exactly what I meant, and then Brooke called his name from across the lawn, wanting a photo with the dean she'd apparently just introduced herself to, and he went. My mother stood there another moment, mouth open like she had one more sentence loaded, and then she went too. They didn't come to lunch. I hadn't expected them to, but I noticed I'd left the invitation open anyway, which told me something about myself I didn't examine too closely that day, that some part of me still wanted the door unlocked, even while I was walking through a different one. I don't think that's weakness. I think it's just what 22 years does to a person, the way a habit outlasts the reason for it. Vivian, Denise, and I ended up at a small Italian place 4 blocks from campus, the kind with paper placemats and a laminated wine list. The waiter was a college kid, maybe 19, who asked if we were celebrating anything, and Vivian answered before I could, told him her granddaughter had just graduated summa cum laude in structural engineering, said the word summa with a kind of relish, like she'd been saving it. He brought us a free basket of garlic knots he said the kitchen didn't usually comp, and Denise raised her water glass to that too, said we were building quite a tally of small people who showed up correctly that day. Priya, the waiter, each other. It became something of a bit between us for the rest of the meal, counting up the small competencies, the strangers and near strangers who'd done exactly what the moment required, without needing to be asked twice. It was a short list by most standards. It was longer than the one I could make of my own parents. I put my diploma folder on the table between the breadbasket and the water glasses, not because I needed to look at it, but because I wanted it in the frame of the afternoon. Present. Undisputed. Vivian ordered a glass of Prosecco she wasn't supposed to have with her medication, and I let her have it. She raised the glass and said, "To the foundation. Not to me, not to the degree, to the foundation," like she knew exactly what 4 years of studying load paths had actually taught me, which had very little to do with concrete. I didn't hear from my parents again that day. Brooke texted that evening, a single line. Mom said you made a scene, and I read it twice, put the phone face down on the hotel nightstand, and didn't answer. Outside the window, the city was doing its ordinary Saturday evening, brake lights and a couple arguing lightly on the sidewalk about where to eat, none of it waiting on my family to resolve anything. My mother called twice more that week, and I let both calls go to voicemail before finally picking up the third, mostly because I didn't want silence to start doing the family's talking for it, the way silence in that house always had. She didn't apologize, not directly. She said she hadn't realized how much the seat had meant to me, which wasn't quite the same thing, but I let it stand. I told her I loved her, which was true, and that I needed some distance from how decisions got made in our family, which was also true, and that both of those things could exist in the same sentence without canceling each other out. She didn't fully understand that, I don't think. I'm not sure she needed to, for it to still be the right thing to say. I keep the diploma in a frame on my desk now, next to a small pencil sketch Vivian did decades ago of the apartment building where she raised me, elevation view, every window drawn to scale even though she'd never had an engineering class in her life. She just understood, the way people who've had to build things out of not enough always do, that a structure only stands if the load goes somewhere solid. I look at that sketch most mornings before I open my laptop, and I think about the 90 seconds it took a stranger to fix what my family wouldn't, and about walking that stage with my eyes forward, looking for the one person who'd always shown up, and finding her exactly where I expected her to be.